Hello. So I wanted to do something hopefully a little interesting. Excuse me. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the Rider-Waite-Smith system and the system that I've been using as a reader, sort of the numerological system. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the history of cartomancy and sort of why I've gone where I've gone and where I've come from. In part because I've been really tough on a lot of Rider-Waite-Smith decks in the past year or so. And as I always try to say, my opinions are mine, and it's just a matter of here's the journey I'm on, here's where I'm at. But I want to, be helpful as much as I can, and it's been a while since I've done a video, anything like this. And I also want to, just sort of share my thoughts on how things go and why I'm where I am. So, let's jump in. So as I've talked about many times, this is my very first deck here in front of you. This is the deck I learned on, and I read a bunch of books. In fact, I just reordered the very first book on tarot I ever read because I want to go, and I got rid of it way back when because I didn't connect with it, and I wish I hadn't. So, anyway, that's not the point of this video. I'll talk about that. But what I wanted to do was just sort of talk about like cartomancy in general and the Rider-Waite-Smith system in particular, and the numerological system I use, and sort of how they're complementary and how they're not, and why I feel the way I do. And, this may only be interesting to a handful of people, and that's okay. Hopefully it's interesting to someone. Hopefully this helps folks understand a little bit about where I'm coming from. Just it sparks some interest. So, I've done over the years a handful of reading about the Rider-Waite-Smith system, and there are a couple books that I've read over the years. One of them I don't have as a physical book. It was the Tally Goodwin and Marcus Katz wrote one on the Rider-Waite-Smith deck that I have on my iPad. I can't remember the name of it, but there's also this one I think is one of the best in terms of the symbolism of Rider-Waite-Smith. It's The Secret Language of Tarot by Ruth Ann and Wald Amberstone. I've talked about this before. I think of the books that sort of explore the historical symbolism and the evolution of tarot to the Rider-Waite-Smith system, I think Robert M. Place's history is one of the best. Then there used to be a website, and I don't know what happened to it. Holly Volley used to have a website on sort of the evolution of the cards, the printing of the cards. It was called the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot page, but it's gone with time. And then there was another book. I think this is published by Llewellyn, and it was called The Ultimate Guide to the Rider-Waite Tarot. This is fine. I actually found this to be pretty disappointing, but by that point I had already studied the deck so much that I just it didn't sort of tell me anything I guess I hadn't already learned elsewhere. But again, I think it's a good primer on the deck. So, I had spent a lot of years working with this deck and trying to find something better, and really avoiding the kinds of decks I'm using now, and just in general not finding anything better. I really wanted something that had less Christian imagery at that point. I really just wanted something that felt fresher. I just wanted something else, and I wasn't really finding it. So I stuck with it, and I spent a long time working with this. And there was a stretch of time where the only two decks I was really using were this one or some permutation, usually the Universal Weight, because I found that one easier on the eyes. I didn't like it as much, but I found it easier to sort of read for others with. And the Shadowscapes, which is very Rider-Waite-Smith influenced. So, from my research, and again, we don't have a whole lot of information about this stuff, right? Because no one was necessarily documenting it, and a lot of the history was adjusted to suit the needs of various creators and societies. But we sort of get Atea as the first person to kind of push the full deck as a divinator, the full tarot deck as a divinatory tool. He appears to be the first one who assigned the elements to the suits, although the correspondences, I think, were switched later on, I think by Papus or one of the slightly later French occultists. A lot of the later occultists really kind of discredited Atea's work. And we don't know fully what he made up and what he didn't, but in the book, The History of the Esoteric Tarot, which I reference, this is why I have this here, because I can't remember the names of anything. Excuse me. The Esoteric Tarot, by Ronald Decker. He talks about Atea and his work and how much it influenced later cartomancers. And of course we know that reading with cards was something that happened before. What seems to be, historically the case is that reading with cards, playing cards of various numbers, seems to have been common before the tarot was deemed to be a mystical tool. Right, before boy, I really should write these things down before I start talking. Before Court de Gébelin sort of pronounced that the tarot was the book of ancient wisdom, it was just a game, but playing cards were used for divination by folk magicians, by people sitting around a table, mostly women. And it's an interesting thing to me, and I'm curious to see if someone takes up this mantle and writes about how the people who would most likely have been cartomancers prior to Court de Gébelin would have been women, the midwives, the folk magicians, and then when the esotericists came along, they were by and large men. Even though the two most famous decks from that period from the esotericists were painted or drawn by women, the names of the men who quote created them were the names we know for today we call it the Rider-Waite-Smith, but it was the Rider-Waite for years and years and years, and we still don't call it the Crawley Harris Tarot. We call it the Thoth Tarot, right? So, and it's by Aleister Crowley. So anyway, there's a little diversion there. Anyway, so what I wanted to talk about, though, and where I'm getting to, is that because divination with playing cards existed before the Rider-Waite-Smith system came along, and what the esotericists did was they sort of took what already existed and built on it. And it seems, again, there's not a whole lot of knowledge, of like documentation of this, but Atea had written books on divination with cards, and it seems that his systems were largely influenced by folk readers, folk magicians, not esotericists per se. And that is really the kernel of what I'm getting at here, because in that tradition, by and large, suits had very strong energies. And for folks who read those that playing cards today, and who there are many people who never read tarot at all, they started reading playing cards. The assignments of the suits seem to be very much in line with what Atea had contributed to books on playing cards, and eventually to his meanings for the minor arcana. Now, in playing cards, it's fairly consistent, if not completely consistent, that some suits are happier than others. So here's a book that's from the 70s, 1976, that was recommended, called The Card Reader's Handbook by Regina Russell. And in it she gives meanings of all 56 cards, but she talks just really briefly at the beginning of the book about the suits. And you can see, just sort of the practical meanings, and she also has spiritual meanings, but they're very similar. The suit of diamonds is money, rewards, improvement through effort, restlessness, nervousness, energy, movement, reaping what has been previously sown, the intellect. The suit of hearts is about satisfaction, love, romance, peace, rest, calm, contentment, happiness, laziness, emotions, and the family. The suit of clubs is business, work, practical use of time, social activities, friends, exercise, progress through participation, learning and teaching, sowing to reap later. And then the suit of spades, which came to us as the suit of swords in tarot, is trouble, delay, problems, fear, loneliness, anger, non-progress, stagnation, frustration, hate, force being applied so learning takes place whether or not it's wanted. And then even if you go into the more spiritual meanings of the cards, the suit of spades is fate, being forced to learn through arduous and difficult situations, accumulating bad karma, or putting the soul of unwanted tendencies in preparation to beginning process and a more balanced nature, the stage before progress begins. So the suits had very strong central personalities, as they do today. And they weren't always consistent. For example, if we look at later cartomancy things like the Lenormand decks, for example, this is not a strictly traditional Lenormand. This is the maybe Lenormand, but I picked it because there are a lot. It's not the suit of spades necessarily that has the difficulty. A lot of them are in the suit of clubs, but you can see most of the cards in the suit of clubs. You have sickness, you've got the bear, which is generally a neutral positive card, the broom, which is usually negative, the mountain, which is usually negative, the clouds are usually negative, the ring is positive generally. This is not a Lenormand card, but it is in this suit. So this fighting, conflict, cross swords, the cross of burden, the shattered mirror, the mice, the cat, which in this particular deck is considered sort of negative, and the fox are all in that suit. So in cartomancy, even though there isn't a lot of consistency necessarily between systems, generally a suit would be assigned to different parts of our lives in a different way than we tend to think of the elements today. And I'm going to come back to that. Hopefully this is interesting and making sense. It's getting somewhere, believe it or not. But one of those suits would always be about the stuff that sucks, right? You know what I mean? Now, the other thing that Atea did that I mentioned was that he assigned the 4 elements to the suits of the tarot. Although, again, they were switched. Wands was originally air and swords was originally fire, if I'm not mistaken. That could be slightly off, but they were switched later. That didn't seem to be a big concern, though. You know what I mean? It seems, again, and I'm just judging by my reading and my sort of limited knowledge of the history of this, but it seems like in the early days of tarot being used for anything other than gameplay, what seemed to be most important was making it valid by creating as many correspondences as could be found from wisdom traditions, esoteric traditions, religious traditions. So from Court de Gébelin through Papists to Samuel MacGregor Mathers and the Golden Dawn, over the course of its journey, where the Golden Dawn really kind of took ownership of tarot in a way, the Kabbalistic associations were assigned, the astrological associations were assigned, the elemental associations were wrestled with, the associations with Hebrew letters, with the signs of the zodiac, with alchemical connections, and all sorts of other things. Those really sort of began being painted on the cards. And it seems, in retrospect, without having been there and having been part of the debates and the conversations around this stuff, that it was really about sort of proving the point that this was a mystical tool, because look at all the systems that it embodies. Now, I'm a believer, and no one has yet, although I've read in the Ronald Decker book, that there's some evidence to suggest that there may have been hidden knowledge in the images, certainly in the trumps. And Robert M. Place even argues that those images, regardless of whether or not they were intended to be secret knowledge, were symbols that would have been familiar because of the rise of Neoplatonic societies and thinking and the Renaissance, all of those sort of natural philosophical emergences would have made those images familiar. So, I'm a believer that there was no intent in the tarot other than gameplay initially. I don't believe that there's any, any forced correlation between any of tarot and its mystical correspondences. I think what correspondences do work and make sense, it just makes it all cooler. And because it's cool that things sort of, even though they were created separately, come together nicely. And it does seem that humanity in general has a penchant for, or a preference for, certain numbers, and we're very drawn to certain ratios and maths, as it were. But I don't think that there was any connection between tarot and mysticism in its early days. I think all of that was applied later, in part because it seemed to fit so effortlessly in some cases. And in some cases, whether it was effortful or not. I think again, this is my personal opinion, but excuse me. I think the astrological associations to tarot are really labored, in my opinion, and I don't find it helpful. But I'm just, for many people it seems natural and effortless, and of course they were meant to correspond. So, it's hard to run away from the fact that there are the same number of trumps as there are Hebrew letters, right? So, so where we're getting ultimately is that the Rider-Waite-Smith system came along in the midst of the Golden Dawn and all of this esotericism and mystical thought and magical thought being lacquered onto what was, in my opinion, initially just a deck of playing cards for a game that we know was the predecessor of modern bridge. Where the correspondences seem to fit, folks like Waite and Crowley took advantage of those, and where they didn't, they crammed their theories or the cards to fit. Hence the the reversal of justice and strength, for example. The suits were never as important to esotericists because they didn't super care about divination, which is what many of us today use tarot for, at least partly. And so when it comes to the suits of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, what seems to have happened is that Pamela Coleman Smith was drawing on the work of Atea and others on more cartomantic views of the suits, right? So hence we have a suit of swords that's by and large picturing largely negative experiences. And that, we could leave it at that, because in essence there was no tradition before Court de Gebelen and Atea and the Golden Dawn folks assigned correspondences to it. And so that tradition is by and large the quote original way, because nothing existed before that. But one of the things that happened over the course of time was that the elemental associations were placed on the suits. And though they didn't seem to affect the meanings, the cartomantic meanings, all that much, over time, the elements have become kind of important to some folks. And sort of cut to now, right? So, there are those of us who have tried to find in the Rider-Waite-Smith suits a connection to the elements that appear very much to be, even in the imagery, if you look at the aces, you have very much, in all really cases but the wands, a very elemental quality to them. And in the coloration even, you get a touch of that. And so for some folks, that elemental correspondence has really come to the fore over the years. But when you get into the suit, it kind of falls apart if you take the element as really important, in my opinion. And let me talk about why. So let me just for a moment put these aside and talk about the suit of swords, okay? Because this is the suit that's gotten a lot of my ire over the years. All right, so I'm gonna actually, let's put the ace aside, and I'm gonna just draw out as many of these as I can make visible. Let's put these guys over here. So we can see most of that. Not all of it, most of it. And these pictures are familiar enough that, you know, even if you can't see the whole thing. Oh, they're not even in order here. 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. So, okay, so we can see most of that. So let's say for a second that I am a believer in the Rider-Waite-Smith system. A believer isn't the right word. I'm a fan of. I've been working with that. And I'm coming from an old sort of cartomantic tradition. In many ways, I get what Regina Russell says about the suit of spades. When I look at these images: trouble, delay, problems, fear, loneliness, anger, non-progress, stagnation, frustration, hate, force being applied so learning takes place whether or not it's wanted. This is this is largely a difficult suit of images. The suit of wands is also kind of similar. None of these are necessarily pleasant images. Even the ones that over the years we've assigned a sort of positive meaning to, like the 2 and the 4. Nobody wants to necessarily be stuck in that position. Nobody certainly wants to be literally this image, right? Because it's an image of a grave or a monument. And then everything else, the 3, the 5, the 6 to a lesser degree, the 7, 8, 9, and 10, all of these are pretty ugly. Even the 6 has a measure of funeral. It reminds me of Orpheus, going into the underworld. It just has a very sad quality to it. So it's easy if you want to, and it's certainly viable and accurate and fair to read the suit of swords as a suit of struggle. And there's more, I would say, tradition to that than the way that I've come to do it now. That said, I don't and have never really read the suit that way, because somewhere along the line, very early on in my reading, I was told and learned and accepted that the suit of swords represents the mind. It represents communication. It represents what we say, what we think, what we learn. That was really interesting and important to me. But when I looked at this array, I couldn't see that anywhere. Do you know what I mean? But that's not the case in all the suits, right? Like if I look at the suit of cups, which we know to be about emotions and feelings and love, we do get a slightly more literal narrative there. Put the ace aside here. We've got what looks like lovers, what looks like a party, what looks like apathy. We've got like heartbreak and loss. We've got gifts and feeling overwhelmed by emotion, moving away, and then the sort of joy. Like the suit of cups very much feels like an emotional suit. It feels like it's about relationships. But the suit of swords, to me, doesn't necessarily feel like it's about thinking and talking. And if it is, it's about fighting. You know what I mean? And sometimes communication is fighting. Sometimes thinking we are at war with our minds. You know what I mean? Sometimes it is all about conflict. But even the suit of cups for me is not necessarily just about romance. To me, if I accept cups as water, as thinking and feeling, and all of the, not thinking and feeling, but feeling, intuition, all of those things that we associate water with, then in that is going to be the things I feel about my family, the things I feel about my job, the things I feel about my friends. So, for some reason, and I don't know why, the elemental narrative, the elemental associations became really important to me over the years, because they seemed so elegantly to speak to the different parts of our lives that I get asked to read about and that I want to read about. But if I would pull out a draw of cards, and I would say, well, so the three of swords is really about communication. It's about what you're thinking. It's about what you're saying. It's about what you're learning. It took a lot of steps to get to how that connected to the image of the three of swords here. And ultimately what I settled on, and I have videos on this you can see in the past, even as early as early this year, where I'm talking about how this card represents the loss that we experience, the growth, the lessons we learn through loss. But again, I feel like when I look at this suit in general as a suit of diplomacy, a suit of articulate, of writing, of letters, of thinking, of learning, I just am trapped by so many of these pictures. So over time, I began to feel, I need those elements, you know what I mean? And I need the pictures to support the elements that I'm talking about, you know? If I'm talking to someone and the Six of Cups comes up, you know, this card, for example, is frequently associated with nostalgia and memories. That's a very emotional thing. But sometimes it just didn't make sense to me. You know, I would stare at this picture, you know, and I'm not a very visual person. I guess that's the other piece of the puzzle here. You know, so occasionally I would, for example, pick up on something like, oh, there's this guard here that's walking away. And you know what I mean? But oftentimes I would be talking about work, and I would have this image of childhood and nostalgia for youth, and it wouldn't connect somehow. And the number of steps it took me mathematically to get where I wanted to go or needed to go as a reader to answer the question I was being asked was hard, and I would frequently find it frustrating. So, you know, a year and a half or so ago, it occurred to me that I could ignore the pictures. Or I could find another way to do it. And that coincided with just a desire to learn. Not a desire to learn, but you know, I talked about this a lot last year. My goal for last year was to make my readings, or when I say last year, I really mean this year, 2017, was to make my readings better. That was my goal for me. You know what I mean? And as always, anything I say is just, it's about my experience. It's not that I'm doing something the right way. There are readers who give amazing readings. One person that I work with, as sort of like a mentor for my coaching sessions, does the most insightful, precise readings with Rider-Waite-Smith cards that I have ever heard. I won't say her name just because, in case she doesn't want people to know, but I think she's brilliant, and she manages to find in the pictures amazing connections to the question that often don't have anything to do with the meaning that we know. You know, she is that good a reader that she can look at the Five of Swords and say to me, you know, one person is bigger than the other two, and so that makes me think about how ego is at play, you know, and this desire to be above everyone. You know what I mean? Like, she'll just, and it's not just rambling. It's not just like grasping at straws. She is picking the exact, you know, it's just kind of brilliant. So some people are more visual. I think that's another thing to keep in mind. And I'm not super visual. So anyway, let me, let me, sort of do act 2 now, of this conversation, right? So I found the pictures to be limiting in many cases. I found that the suit that mattered a lot to me of swords, because as a writer and as a trainer, an educator, as someone who teaches, as someone who writes and communicates and thinks a lot about this stuff, the experience that I wanted wasn't being captured in the suit images that I was seeing in most decks. And when I reach for a Rider-Waite-Smith inspired deck, regardless of how new or fresh it is, generally the suit of swords is going to be the one that I struggle with most, because it depicts the suit of spades, from old Cartomancy, and its predecessors, and I needed something else. So what I just want to sort of do is show you what I mean by that a little bit more as I talk through. So this is Act 2 of the video. If this were This American Life, this would be Act 2. I'll try to put a timestamp for anyone who wants to jump to this, I guess, although you won't know that it's coming. What I wanted to do is actually talk about the numerology that I've developed, and how it works with and against the Rider-Waite-Smith system, and why I've sort of come away from the Rider-Waite-Smith system a little bit, and what I mean when I say that pip decks can be freeing. So I'm going to use my book a little bit just to kind of reference a couple things. If you want to see my full meanings for each of the numbers that I developed, I did the same activity that's basically the first lesson in Tarot on Earth. This is the proof. It's gotten to be a mess, but it's on my website. So I have a spreadsheet that sort of gives full definitions of each of the numbers that I developed. In the book, I actually give very brief correspondences, just because what I didn't want to do is essentially give you the answers. I want you to find that on your own. But I'm going to use just the basics here to sort of show what I mean, for anyone who's interested and curious about how the Rider-Waite-Smith deck does what it does really well, and how I needed something else, and why. All right. So I'm not going to work with the aces at the moment, because they are actually the simplest, and they really are the essence of the suit. In the book, I sort of talk about them as, and didn't bookmark the page, but seeds, impulses, and urges, right? But that you get in most decks. So now the 2 for me represents duality, pairing, connection, and balance. And actually, in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, in many of the cases, you do sort of feel a very balanced duality, coming together energy. Certainly in the 2 of Cups, there's definitely a struggle for balance, or to maintain balance in the 2 of Swords. It's an act of sort of choosing which duality can mean, in the Pentacles, and then the Wands has sort of a wistful quality to me that doesn't necessarily seem to connect ultimately to the keywords that I've given it. You know what I mean? But if I were to sort of think about duality or pairing or connection or balance, it doesn't jump as easily to me as the rest do. So the number has come to matter to me a lot too, because in order to make the element make sense, you have to give it. All right, let me say that in a different way. In order for the element to do what I need it to do, I needed something beyond what the pictures were telling me, and that was where numerology came into the picture. And the purpose of doing what I'm doing right now is to show how sometimes the numerology and the elemental correspondence match up, and sometimes they don't, and why I feel like, for me, it's liberating to not have to have a picture telling me or suggesting to me a meaning. So if I were to explore the 2 of Swords, for example, as a combination of the suit of air and the number 2, what I'm really thinking about is thoughts, communications, lessons, again, all of those things, diplomacy, writing, and then I'm thinking about duality, pairing, and balance. And so when I think about the combination of those 2 things, I think about what are, and this is a lot of what Tarot on Earth is about, really, especially the first half of the book, is sort of putting that equation together. So I'm saying duality, pairing, balance, connection, the mind, communication, thoughts, thinking, lessons. And so I sort of say, what I'm really thinking about is being of two minds about something, or trying to reconcile two points of view, trying to connect, you know, a way to communicate like a complicated thought that may have that may be binary. You know what I mean? There may be two sides to the equation, and you kind of get that in here in this image, and certainly when I put the emotions of the cups together, with the two, you definitely get attraction and union and what this card represents. When I put fire together, when I think about wands, what I'm really thinking about, and I actually like the thing I landed on during the elemental activity in the book. So what I sort of landed on wands meaning, or fire meaning, it's what we're passionate about. It's our higher calling, what we view as our higher calling, what we desire or lust for, whether it's people or things. And actually, once I parse it that way, you do kind of get a little bit of that in this image. You know what I mean? So there is kind of a lust for power, a lust for domination in this image. So sometimes they come alive under the math of the element in the numerology, and sometimes they don't. Again, the two is actually by and large in the Rider-Waite-Smith pretty connected, because even with pentacles, I tend to view those as responsibilities, duties, the practical parts of our lives, the things that have to get done, the bills, the taxes, the picking up the kids, and of course two is duality, pairing, duality, definitely all of these things trying to get my attention, trying to juggle all these responsibilities. Again, I get that very clearly. But then, like, when I look at the three, it's a little bit less consistent, and again, the three for me, and I'm simplifying this again just to make an already meandering video a little less meandering, but it's growth, and what I sometimes refer to as triangulation, which is sort of being growth in the sense of like just expanding as two become three, you know what I mean, as one and two add and become three, and triangulation is sort of the expansion into a shape, you know what I mean, into sort of manifesting and sort of a making of something, you know what I mean. If you think about conception, one and two become three, a baby comes out of that, or a seed grows, so it has like a growth, but it goes from, like, if you think about one as a dot and two as a line, three suddenly becomes a triangle, and suddenly there's a shape. You kind of get that a little bit in the Three of Pentacles. The Three of Wands is a little, it's a little evasive. But it's there. But here in the Three of Swords, where I need to talk about an expanding mind, a growing ability to communicate, lessons that we're learning, the ability to articulate complex thoughts, or increasingly complex thoughts, here's the Solabuska sort of in my way, so it just becomes a really unbalanced moment there for me. You get it, you get the numerology a little bit with the Three of Cups. So I don't think it's worth necessarily me going through all of them. But there are times too where, like, the Pentacles and the Cups sort of, for example, give me, we've got the famous Miser and we've got the famous Apathy here. Four for me is about stability, foundation. If you think about a square as a solid, then, the Four of Pentacles could very well be financial stability, or responsible or stable responsibilities. The picture is limiting in its way, though, because we get, kind of a miser. The Four, again, doesn't sort of connect as we would have stable feelings, stable emotion, feelings that are solid enough to build a relationship on. The Four of Swords would be stable thinking, or solid research, solid foundation. You know what I mean? Like, what you're communicating is based on something strong. So, it's an interesting thing. It's just, I guess what I'm trying to get to is that it's a different system. And they can work together because you can say that this represents apathy and that it means, stable emotion. You know what I mean? Like, it can be whatever you want it to be. It's just that I have found in my reading, though I'm not very visual, I will frequently focus so much on the picture, or the person I'm reading for will, that what I'm saying doesn't necessarily make sense. And because people are largely visual, they're going to remember what they see more than what they hear. And so if I'm doing a reading for someone and I'm talking about having, a real dedication to being thoughtful and stable in the way you approach your work. Like, it may not be the work you want to do right now, but your responsibility is to get this work done so that you build a foundation for what you're going to do in the future. And they see this sort of penny pincher. That penny pincher may stick with them, even though what I'm saying is, it's not about being a miser. It's just about, like, investing right now in doing something stable so that you can have the liberty to do, the message to me is more nuanced than this picture says. You know what I mean? So, and it's a complicated thing to talk about. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. And I do believe what Yoav Bendov says in his book, that there's no accidents. So if you pill this card and you say that it's something of miserliness or hoarding money or something like that, then that may be equally valid. And of course, if you're trying to build for the future, being stingy is there. It's just that I sometimes feel like I get trapped, by the image. So ultimately where I'm getting to is that the reason why I've moved away a bit from Rider-Waite-Smith, is because I feel like I'm not bound by the image. And the reason why that's important to me is because what my readings seem to want were to prefer the elements over the older Cartomancy readings. Do you know? To prefer the parts of our lives represented by the elements over the Suit of Swords just being about struggle. I needed, as a reader, to be able to talk about communication in a fuller way. I needed to be able to do that. I needed to be able to talk about the Suit of Wands not as a burdens and victories and wounds, but as about what we want, what we desire, whether that's people or things or the stuff we view as our calling. That's what I needed that suit to be about, because those are the kinds of things I care about. And I think in many ways, those are the people who are attracted to my readings are pulled towards that too. And that's another thing, I guess, is whatever, whether you're reading for someone else or for yourself, you're ultimately you're gonna fill the gap that you need as a reader. If you're reading for yourself, you're going to develop a system over time that speaks to the kinds of things that you want answers to. And I think if you start to build a practice, whether you're paid or not, of reading for others, people are going to be attracted to the kinds of readings you do because you do the kinds of readings that answer the questions that they want. I, in my journey, felt like I wasn't giving very good readings in general, and what I needed to do it better was to sort of reconcile my methods, and so that's what I've done. There's nothing wrong with any system. I'm just sort of opening up the door a little bit to explore how I landed where I did and why I landed where I did, and nothing of this is a criticism of any system. It's just an exploration of why I do the way I do. And when I talk about the Suit of Swords, why I talk about the Suit of Swords that way. Why I don't think I get cranky, but why I sort of hope for more elasticity in decks. Why, when I'm drawn to Rider-Waite-Smith decks, I'm drawn to decks that give me some space. I love the Darkness of Light Tarot, for example, but I don't use it very much because it's very, very, very much like the images in this deck. I'm more likely to use the Anima Mundi, for example, because there's a lot simpler images. And really, when I'm reading by and large for others, I'm almost exclusively using Marseille-style decks now anyway. So, but anyway, I mean, this is really sort of a vlog more than anything else, and hopefully it was moderately interesting. So I'll take this to a close. Maybe if this sparked questions, let me know. And again, there's no wrong way to do anything as long as you have a system that works for you and you're relatively consistent with it. I changed my system because the system I had wasn't doing what I wanted it to. And that was, that was what I needed to do. What I'm doing in the book, by the way, is not trying to impose my system on you, but help you figure out a system that works for you that's similar to the one that I'm doing, because I found that what I wanted to do were very practical readings, and that was the thing that I was missing. And so essentially this is what I put myself through in order to get there. And it seems to have been successful based on feedback from people I've read for. So anyway, I will wrap up because this is an insanely long video and it may not have made sense anyway. But take care and let me know if you have thoughts or questions.